In this video, we have a research paper from 2021 that discusses whether or not Spinosaurus was a heron mimic, a bird that uses mimicry to confuse potential predators. So let's talk about it. Hi, I'm here with my channel. If you haven't seen our recent episode on this topic yet, go check it out. This is part 2. The new paper, though, adds some new ideas that are worth discussing. Let's get into it. So, just to recap, there has been discussion in scientific literature for quite a while now over whether Spinosaurus could swim underwater or not. And it seems pretty clear at this point that it could, that it spent a lot of time in the water, but a new idea proposed by a group of researchers in 2020 suggested that maybe this was because Spinosaurus was trying to avoid being eaten by birds. They noticed that the closest living relatives of Spinosaurids today are largely piscivorous, or fish-eating birds like herons. And they also noticed that these birds often spend a lot of time near water, where they use their long legs to wade and probe for fish. And this is where the idea of Spinosaurus as a heron mimic comes from. It would make sense for a large theropod living in the same environment to adopt similar behaviors, especially if herons were big enough to eat smaller individuals. Basically, they were suggesting that the ecological pressures of the environment would favor a theropod who looked like a heron, because then potential eagle predators would be less likely to attack them. But since the publication of that paper, a number of other scientists have discussed the idea that herons aren't actually the closest relatives of the Spinosaurs. And even if they are, the behavior might not be inherited from those ancestors. So, what do we know about herons as potential models for understanding the ecology of Spinosaurs? Well, first of all, herons do seem to be one of the closest relatives of the Spinosaurs. There's no doubt about that. But secondly, while herons today are largely piscivorous, that doesn't seem to have been the case for all herons throughout history. For example, fossil evidence suggests that some ancestral herons were more omnivorous, feeding on both animals and plants. What's interesting, though, is that this appears to have happened multiple times independently in different groups of birds. And the authors of the new paper suggest that this is due to ecological pressures caused by competition with other aquatic birds. But while the authors of the 2020 paper argue that herons may have been potential eagle prey, I think we need to look at this a bit more carefully. Eagles don't only eat fish, and it's generally thought that the size threshold for eagle predation is around 40 kg. So it would appear that if herons were in fact being regularly eaten by eagles, then they would need to be larger than this, and that would imply that they were also eating larger prey. So the question becomes, did herons ever get big enough to be eaten by eagles? Well, it does appear so. See, herons range in size from the little bitty pygmy heron, which is only around 8 centimeters tall, all the way up to the great blue heron, which can be nearly a meter tall. And the great blue heron is still only around 3 kilograms. But there is evidence that ancient herons, specifically the genus Pleopublius, which lived between 23 and 6 million years ago, reached much larger sizes. Some of these species were around 1.7 meters tall and weighed almost 9 kilograms, and these were still only slightly larger than modern-day herons. So there's a possibility that some herons were large enough to be attacked by eagles, and that these large herons adopted behaviors that reduced their chances of being eaten. The problem, though, is that we don't have very good data on the size of most extinct herons. We tend to underestimate how large they really were. So, while I think it's probably safe to say that some of them were around 3 kilograms, it's harder to say whether or not any of them were 40 kilograms or more. So if we want to understand the role of herons in the evolution of Spinosaurs, we need to find some bigger fossils. And this leads us to the third issue with using herons as a model for understanding Spinosaurs, which is that herons are just one of many groups of birds that have independently evolved to feed on fish. In fact, it seems like this is a fairly common adaptation among birds. And what the authors of the new paper are pointing out is that there are actually a bunch of other groups of birds that spend a lot of time near water and use their legs to catch fish. And what they're suggesting is that maybe we shouldn't automatically assume that these behaviors are due to avoiding eagle predation. Maybe there are other factors at play. For example, Maybe it's just generally easier to find food in shallow water. Or maybe it has something to do with nesting. See, in general, birds that nest in loose colonies with widely spaced nests like herons, ibises, and spoonbills, they tend to have to deal with nest predators. And this isn't always the case, but when it is, you see that they tend to spend a lot of time in the water. Not only does this help them find food, but it helps them keep an eye out for predators. If they're in the water, they can see an approaching fox or something and escape before it can steal their eggs or chicks. And this, I think, is actually a great example of something that might have driven the evolution of Spinosaurs. In fact, it's possible that this behavior wasn't directly related to eagles at all. Instead, it may have been driven by selection from a completely different predator. The authors cite several studies that found that dinosaurs and birds that attempted to nest in large groups had their nests raided by large theropods. So, if large theropods were stealing eggs from nests, it makes sense for a theropod like Spinosaurus to avoid nesting in large groups. And it makes sense for it to spend a lot of time in the water where it could both find food and watch out for predators. Now, there's nothing in this paper that directly contradicts the idea that Spinosaurus was a heron mimic. I think it's possible. I think it makes sense. But what I like about this paper is that it expands the discussion beyond just herons and eagles. It broadens it to consider the broader context of the environment that Spinosaurus lived in and the many different ecological pressures that may have acted on it. And that's the thing about science, right? Science is always moving forward. Each new discovery or each new piece of information that we find changes the way that we view the world. And sometimes it changes our perspective on old discoveries. We learn something new that causes us to re-examine things that we thought we already understood. And in doing so, we deepen our understanding of the world. So what does this mean for Spinosaurus? Well, personally, I still think that Spinosaurus probably was a heron mimic to some extent. But I think it's important to recognize that there may have been other factors at play here as well. While it may have helped Spinosaurus avoid eagle predation, there may have been other reasons for spending so much time in the water. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind as we continue to study Spinosaurs and as we study other organisms as well. When we talk about adaptations, we often tend to oversimplify things and think about each adaptation as arising independently and for a single reason. But the reality is that each adaptation represents a compromise between a bunch of different factors, and as scientists, we have to try to account for all of these factors when we're trying to understand why things are the way that they are. So, thanks for coming along on this mini Spino saga. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and if you have a favorite Spino fact that you'd like to share, leave a comment below. Everyone, thanks for watching. See ya!